Okay, so this two-step dance, diplomatic recognition. Texas is an independent nation. Other countries in the world acknowledge that, recognize that. And then very quickly, Texas would be annexed into the United States. That was the order that it had to happen in for it to be legal internationally. So what Houston does, and I can't stress to you enough that this was Houston's major priority as president. He served 2 terms as president of Texas, but uh, uh, all along, this was his priority number one, getting Texas into the United States. So he sends 2 diplomats, a guy by the name of Wharton, which is how we get Wharton, Texas, and a guy by the name of Hunt. Maybe that's how we get Hunt, Texas, really beautiful area on the Guadalupe, west of San Antonio. He sends 2 diplomats up to Washington to lobby. But much to their surprise and much to Houston's surprise, because I think Houston kind of thought this was going to go really smoothly, that there'd been so much interest in bringing Texas into the United States just generally. Remember, way back in 1803, Jefferson had claimed Texas. And especially slaveholders, the slaveholding South was determined to bring Texas into the Union because there was so much land that was in Texas that could be used for cotton cultivation. So, Jackson was friendly with Houston. And so I think Houston thought that this would go pretty smoothly. But what happens is it doesn't go as quickly as he had hoped. First of all, Andrew Jackson is hesitant to annex Texas or even to recognize Texas for a couple of reasons. First of all, he doesn't want a war with Mexico. Mexico we forget about, in Texas, we forget how angry or what a tragedy the loss of Texas was to Mexico. But we also forget that Mexico was determined to bring Texas back into the Mexican nation even after 1836. Now, this turned out to be a pipe dream. Mexico didn't have nearly enough military power to make that wish come true. But Mexico was absolutely determined. It made no secret about this. And so Jackson was a little bit reluctant to offend Mexico by recognizing Texas and then bringing Texas into the United States. Now, to jump ahead 10 years, this is exactly the sequence of events that happens. The U.S. comes into the United States in late 1845. Mexico goes nuts. They break relations with the United States. And 2 years later, there's a war between Mexico and the United States. Now, there were other circumstances surrounding that war. But Jackson wasn't quite ready for a war with Mexico, and he thought that that's what might happen if the U.S. immediately recognized and then annexed Texas. Then the other thing that happened is that in the North, what we're starting to see in the United States is the split between states where there was slavery and states where slavery didn't exist. And this is a very complicated story. It's partly Texas history story, it's more a U.S. history story. But long story short, the states that didn't have slavery, the states in the North, all the way from Pennsylvania to Ohio, Illinois, north of the so-called Mason-Dixon line, which was the border between Maryland and Pennsylvania, slavery had died out in these states by 1836. And most of the whites in these states actually didn't care about slaves. They didn't care about the existence of slavery in places like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. They didn't want slavery to expand into any new territory. This is really what the Civil War is about. It's not that whites in the North, where there wasn't slavery, were that opposed to slavery. They didn't really think about it that much. They could live with it. But what they didn't want was slavery expanding into new territory, especially as the United States expanded. And this, in essence, is what the Civil War is about. As the United States expanded from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, including Texas, would slavery, the system of slavery, go along with it? And part of this was political, because remember, if Texas comes into the Union as a slave state, that means that states have 2 more senators, because remember, every state has 2 senators, and then it has a number of additional members of the House of Representatives. So what this really is political. So what you have is that in the 1836, 1837, when these guys Wharton and Hunt come up to Washington, they get involved in the tangle over the expansion of slavery. Should the United States be a slave nation or a free nation? And there are a lot of people in the North, like people in Mexico then and today, that the Texas Revolution stunk to high heaven from their point of view. It just seemed like a plot to extend slavery into Texas, to extend the territory of slavery across the Sabine River into Texas. That all along it had been a pro-slavery expansionist plot, to a conspiracy to bring Texas, Mexican Texas, into the Union as a slave state, which would both expand slavery in the United States, but it would also increase the political power of the slave South as well. So there's a lot of suspicion among Northerners about the request of Texas to come into the Union. There's a lot of suspicion about the entire Texas Revolution itself. And so Jackson has to deal with this. So long story short, when Hunt and Wharton, when they go up to Washington in 1836, 1837, these things all take a long time, they run into much more resistance than they thought about Texas very, very smoothly and seamlessly going into the United States. They pretty much expected this was the way it was going to go. So things stalled, and people are Wharton and Hunt are very, very angry, offended, they're humiliated, they're shocked. They just thought it would be natural that Texas would become part of the United States. But they ran into trouble. This fear of a Mexican reaction, the anti-slavery forces, especially people that don't want slavery to expand. So it doesn't go along the way they thought it would. But Jackson does Houston and the other folks that want Texas to be part of the United States on the very last day that he's president. And it's significant. He waits until the last day he's president because he wants to leave the mess for somebody else. But on the last day he's president, or the second to the last day he's president, Jackson recognizes Texas as an independent nation. That's just something that Jackson can do as president of the United States. So what Texas does is, the folks that want Texas to be part of the U.S., they get half a loaf. They get recognition by the U.S. government that Texas is an independent nation. And Texas, the U.S. sends a diplomat to Texas to represent U.S. interest. This may not seem like a big deal to students sitting in a Texas history class, but internationally, this was a huge deal, because what it did was it added legitimacy to the Texas Revolution. What the United States was saying to the rest of the world was that the U.S. believed that Texas was not a province in rebellion against Mexico City, that Texas was, in fact, an independent nation that stood alone among the community of nations in the world. So Jackson does a huge favor for Texas by recognizing the independence of Texas. But note, again, he does this at the very, very, very tail end of his presidency because he doesn't want to deal with the consequences. But on the whole, Texans are embarrassed, they're humiliated, they're angry that the U.S. doesn't recognize and then annex Texas. And so Texas, in effect, becomes an independent nation, and is an independent nation for about a decade by default. This is not what Texans wanted. This is not what the vast majority of Texans wanted. This isn't what Sam Houston wanted. But circumstances weren't ripe yet for Texas to become part of the United States. Now, 10 years later, circumstances, the stars would align, but that's not until 1845.